On the morning of February 24th this year, the people of Ukraine woke up to find themselves in the middle of a war zone, as Russian President Vladimir Putin set his sights on a sovereign nation he felt entitled to. What followed were events ranging from horrific to inspiring that had the world watching as Russian forces kept up their aggression against all reason, yet Ukrainian forces stood their ground against all odds. Les Aliens. It has been 3 months since missiles struck the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. And while hashtags standing for Ukraine and fearing for World War have finally petered out, the war still goes on in a nation that seemed as if it was halfway across the world when, in reality, the effects of its invasion have been felt as if they were right by our doorstep. Looking past rising gas prices and tasteless World War III memes, we must be informed on what's happening over there, how it came to that point, and what it all means for us Filipinos, but most importantly, for the victims of this invasion. While the relationship between Russia and Ukraine stretches back to ancient history, the story of how Russian tanks began treading on Ukrainian soil begins at the end of another conflict, the Cold War. Once part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Ukraine, along with other Slavic territories, split off from the USSR as the Communist Union imploded.
So in 1991, Ukraine decided that it should be an independent republic from Russia. So this is, if you have to look at how did it begin? So it started with, of course, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall.
What followed were decades of independence for Ukraine, establishing a democratic government, as well as strengthening international relations with the European Union. These developments didn't sit well with former agent for the Russian Committee for State Security, better known as the KGB, Vladimir Putin. He eventually ascended to the presidency, where he made it his mission to restore his vision of a once again unified Soviet Union, even recently penning a historically revisionist paper that depicts Ukraine as being Russian in every sense of the word, despite the reality of Ukrainian sovereignty.
Russia now tries to, quote, get back, in one of his speeches, that there is not a Russia and Ukraine, rather there is one Russia, to which Ukraine is part of.
As president, Putin blamed the growing influence of the West as the main thing stopping Soviet reunification, particularly taking issue with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a coalition of nations that pledged to defend each other if Russia were to begin overstepping.
This treaty organization that traditionally has been the enemy of the Soviet Union, set up to basically stop the spread of communism and maybe threaten war against the Soviet Union if ever, gets closer and closer to modern Russia's border. Of course, that's going to scare some Russian leaders, especially those who have their mentality still kind of in the Cold War, which Putin does.
Although NATO proved effective in keeping Russia at bay, Putin found an opportunity when, in 2014, during a revolt to overthrow a pro-Russian administration, the Russians were welcomed by then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych to intervene in an attempt to hold his power. In the chaos, pro-Russian defectors split off to the Donbass region, and Russia was able to set camp in the neighboring Crimea. Ukraine was under attack by a Russian-backed Donbass, holding their border steady. This was the status quo until recently. Putin eventually launched an attack on Ukraine, mobilizing his forces in a full-out invasion under multiple baseless justifications, including a proposed denazification of Ukraine, despite the nation electing a Jewish president in Volodymyr Zelensky.
After Russia annexed Ukraine and encouraged these two republics to secede from Ukraine, the Ukrainians now started talking about joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But it's not on the table of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They know for a fact that once, of course, Ukraine becomes part of NATO, it is just like rubbing salt to the wound of Russia, because they already pushed into Central and Eastern Europe. NATO expansion led to the incorporation of former Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, Hungary, now Czech Republic and Slovakia, Romania, and of course the Baltic states. So it was not actually on the table of NATO for Ukraine to be part of NATO, because they knew the consequence It's Russia that basically raised this issue, despite the fact that NATO had never mentioned that they're entertaining Ukraine's application to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
That brings us to today. Ukraine has been holding on for dear life for the last few months, as Russia shows no signs of stopping their assault. Thousands of Ukrainians have died, and many times more have sought refuge in other countries. Now, knowing the whats and hows, it's important to remind ourselves of why we Filipinos should care about what goes on in a region almost half a world away. Despite warheads and sanctions not making their way to our shores, our country has felt the economic effects of the invasion. Gas prices are at an all-time high, and we're seeing shortages in many resources we imported from Ukraine, from potatoes and wheat to the neon that goes into our electronics.
If one thing happens at the end of the globe, no, it will happen in the Philippines. There would always be an effect.
The world is diplomatically interconnected, with everything that happens in a nation rippling to those that surround it. Physical distance is a moot factor now, as globalization is the international standard. What happens to Ukraine will affect what becomes of the Philippines. Another slightly more worrying issue is the precedent that Russia's actions could set. By commencing this invasion, they have now opened the doors for other nations to do the same, ignoring international law in the name of ruthless expansionism. No country has been more enthused by this development than Russia's biggest ally in this conflict, China. The years of speculation surrounding if or when Russia would invade Ukraine echoes that of rhetoric still being heard about China and Taiwan. The day that the Chinese Communist Party sends warheads and tanks over to Taiwan is sure to become an international conflict the likes of which we've yet to see in modern history.
I think this could embolden Xi Jinping to be more aggressive with his existing methods, but considering that they're also looking at how the world is responding to Russia.
If the war ends in a Ukrainian downfall, the CCP is likely to be emboldened to finally act on their decades-long ambition to snuff out Taiwan. Hence, with their vessels circling our waters like sharks, what would it mean for us and our sovereignty? Will we hold steadfast like the Ukrainians, or crumble under the weight like Crimea? It's best if it never gets to that point. Lastly, Russia's attacks have left a trail of blood and broken homes for the citizens of Ukraine. With Ukrainians seeking refuge in other countries, Russian forces targeting humanitarian efforts to keep them from doing so, and widespread reports of horrific war crimes being done to Ukraine, are we facing a humanitarian crisis?
I think it was a crisis already just from the sheer numbers.
There are over 14 million Ukrainians who have either been left dead, scarred, or with nowhere to call home. Beyond talks of territory or international relations, the war's taken its biggest toll on the people of Ukraine. It's in our human nature to want the best for these people, to not allow their needless suffering to go on. Looking at the numbers, it becomes an issue of economics. Looking at history, it becomes an issue of sovereignty. And looking at the tragedies unfolding before us, it becomes an issue of humanity. On all fronts, this war must come to an end. But what does an end to this conflict actually look like? While admission into NATO is the most ideal, lots of diplomatic red tape has stood in the way of Ukraine getting membership. However, the European Union has sought to fast-track a possible Ukrainian membership. The EU has its own NATO-like defense treaty that could be what turns the tide in this war.
Because war, as we know, is unsustainable. It never lasts. Which is why, no, in the modern liberal sense, the diplomatic option would always be available because bullets are finite, soldiers are finite.
But for us here in the Philippines, we look to nowhere else but Malacanang for answers. President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr.'s stance on the conflict has been shaky at best and dangerously apathetic at worst. Assuming the incoming administration actually sticks to their current stance, then the Philippines will have to take measures to assist in upholding the human rights of our Ukrainian brethren.
So, if you believe in what I'm saying, then we have to tell everyone before it's too late, right?
For now, our hearts must go out to the people of Ukraine, and our efforts must continue in keeping this issue at the forefront of international discourse. We must not allow this to be swept under the rug as Putin intends. This has been Joaquin Olalla, reporting for Arch News. Animo Lasal.